Hi, I'm Mike Reynolds, a senior reporter covering the media industry with S&P Global Market Intelligence, Tech, Media, and Telecom News Team. Welcome to MediaTalk, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, where the news and research staff explore issues in the ever-evolving media landscape. Today, I'm joined by Stefan Modrich, my colleague on the TMT News Team. Stefan covers tech policy and is the author of Washington Wrap, which you can find on Cap IQ Pro. How you doing today, Stefan?
Doing well, Mike. Glad to be here.
Before we get started on many things artificial intelligence and NVIDIA, I wanted to bring our listeners up to speed on Stefan's running exploits. When we last spoke in September, Stefan was about to go marathoning in Germany as a prelude to making the move to the New York event at some point. How'd you make out, Stefan?
It was a great experience. Thanks for asking about it. I managed to finish in exactly 3 hours and 58 minutes. So accomplished my goal of sub 4 hours. And in the process, I managed to run enough races to qualify to earn a bid in the New York Marathon next year. I'm excited for that.
All right. We'll be keeping tabs on that as well. Congratulations. As to NVIDIA, last time we touched upon its agreement with Advanced Micro Devices to pay the U.S. government 15% of their revenue. That, I believe, is part of the Trump administration's broader strategies around asserting leverage over crucial U.S. supply chains and industries. Stefan, we covered this a little bit last time. Bring our listeners up to speed on what that might mean.
Sure, Mike. I think one thing that's important to mention from the start is that while it's true that NVIDIA does have some revenue from chips that it sells to China, it's not the Blackwell chips, which are these advanced AI chips that you're hearing the most often about. The current export control regime is still allowing Blackwell chips to be exported to allies that have been essentially shortlisted by the U.S. And in recently reaching a deal to export to Saudi Arabia, they've even gone beyond that kind of short list of nations in the Pacific like Japan, Korea, and India, those that we would typically see on that G20 list.
All right. So in early November, Market Intelligence published a piece entitled U.S. Promotes AI Exports to Allies, Blocks China Access to NVIDIA Blackwell Chips, which you just mentioned. The key takeaway here is that some chips are allowed to be sold from NVIDIA to China or not? I'm a little confused.
Sure. As of December 8th, President Donald Trump announced that
the U.S.
plans to allow NVIDIA to ship base 200 GPU chips to approved customers in China and other countries. Base 200 is a chip that's estimated to be about twice as powerful as the H20, which was the chip that NVIDIA had designed before this to be able to comply with U.S. export controls for chips that were allowed to be shipped to China. But they're a step below the Blackwell chips. Basically, the condition there is that it will still allow for national security interests to be protected according to the Trump administration. And there's also a condition that adds on to the revenue sharing agreement that we talked about last time that would collect as much as 25% of the revenue. As we're speaking today, China has not yet improved imports of H200 chips. We'll have to wait and see what Beijing does there.
Interesting. President Trump, he did an interview on 60 Minutes. He talked about this. It came after his meeting with the Chinese president, Mr. Jinping. Is there any thoughts or is any thawing that, as you mentioned, the CEO from NVIDIA, he would like some of this to happen?
No, but I would caveat that the Trump administration's national security strategy was published and the language was actually less adversarial than we've seen in the past, and actually more toward getting on the same page of even going as far as to say that the U.S. and China should be engaged in mutually beneficial trade relationships. So that is a stark departure from some of the language that we hear, especially on the Hill from the China hawks. And so that is going to be something that is going to be interesting to see how that is squared with the desire to simultaneously maintain that national security hawk posture with the free market posture. And I think that's probably the fundamental tension that coalition of the GOP faces.
Interesting. So at the same time, again, if there might be some movement toward a resolution, that's one thing. But I think there's some, as you may have alluded to here, if the better chips were get into Chinese hands, so to speak, the U.S. advantage in AI computing would be lost. I think there's some back and forth about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance in unpacking that specific question because Wang and NVIDIA are in this camp that they believe that exporting the American AI stack is a force for good in the world, essentially. And so that is their way of messaging their desire to expand to these untapped markets, phrasing it with the language of China is the second largest market, and we being the U.S. should not concede that not punted without even attempting to compete there.
Okay.
I haven't yet heard one Republican or Democrat say that they agree with NVIDIA's view that the Blackwell chip should be available in China. It does seem like the sorts of arguments that are winning are the more sentimental and nationalistic ones. At least that's what we've seen from the way this is talked about on the Hill. But I think a better way of looking at that is Wang said, for example, that China has twice the amount of electrical capacity that the United States does.
Yep. So
So
he's also advocating for the U.S. to increase its electrical capabilities, its energy capabilities.
yeah, and as our data center experts at 451 know, this obvious correlation there between the increased power demand and that the increased output of these large language models and these AI chatbots and other various AI powered tools, that's going to go hand in hand here for decades to come. So the infrastructure, the knowledge, funding, a lot of those things, those who advocate for kind of greater synergy between the US government and the tech sector here point to China as somewhat of an analog or a model. Not always necessarily that we should be copying pasting what they're doing, but they do look to their kind of more government interventionist model.
Interesting. The situation with China here, it also holds ramifications, though, for other countries as well.
Yeah, some of them we alluded to earlier, definitely Japan and Korea. And I spoke specifically with some experts on Korean memory chip producers. And because some of those are some of the bigger suppliers to Nvidia, they were very adamant that this is a vital component to the Nvidia supply chain for producing those Blackwell chips. And given how intricate and delicate this whole situation is, it remains a very globally connected system right now. And so to have any sort of policy or geopolitical disruption to that would have very dire consequences potentially.
Okay. All right. You had alluded to earlier that Mr. Wang, he'd been on Capitol Hill this past week. What were some of your takeaways? I don't know how many days he was there, but it seems like he made a lot of stops along the way.
Yeah, he definitely seems to be a more frequent guest these days. And given the business he's in, one would presume for good reason. He was there to meet with Senate Republicans on the banking committee. And then he also met with President Trump while he was in town. And then, as usual, the things he says make headlines. But some of the things that were particularly striking from a kind of a nitty-gritty policy standpoint were he essentially made a tacit endorsement of an AI moratorium, which, just to catch folks up on that, basically the effort to direct the federal government to preempt any existing state or local AI laws with one kind of comprehensive federal law. That was an effort that failed to get through the Trump budget bill this summer, but it's been resurrected. Yep. And although it's looking that's unlikely to get through a second time here, but there's also been talk about an executive order that could push that same measure through. And so it does seem like there's little daylight between NVIDIA and the White House on that specific issue. Wang also said that he was pleased with the removal of a bill called the GAIN Act, which would have imposed a lot of conditions on American tech companies who wanted to export chips abroad. And for very understandable reasons, if you think about it from a business perspective, he was very pleased with the decision to spike that bill because of the ease of the compliance burden on the semiconductor industry here.
Okay. You can read more about Stefan and Mr. Wang on Washington Wrap, which again, as I mentioned, is part of Cap IQ Pro. As we get to the end here, I wanted to see what Stefan, as we move from 25 and transition to the new year, what are you going to be looking at? What are some of the things you want to keep tabs on immediately?
Sure, Mike. I think some of these things will be no surprise to a lot of our regular readers and MediaTalk listeners. This debate over how to regulate AI and the infrastructure needed to make it possible that we've been talking about here today is indeed going to remain a very hot topic in 2026 and beyond. And just to give some examples of how, if you're not necessarily seeing that kind of broader policy debate manifest itself and you're curious about why that makes a difference, tune into your local city council meeting and you have very likely probably heard a conversation about whether or not driverless vehicles are going to be allowed in your city. That's been happening all over the country with Waymo and then Tesla's robotaxi and things like that. And that's one way. And then another kind of thing that probably hits close to home for a lot of people is this debate over what devices will be allowed in school classrooms, whether that's tablets, smartphones, laptops. There's been a lot of pushback recently, and especially given the rapidly changing internet-based tools and AI-based tools that are now at students' disposal. It's a whole different deal than just having the Google web browser at your disposal.
Right.
And now you can have ChatGPT and all these other things. So that kind of presents a lot of academic integrity issues and things like that. So that's a whole other thing to grapple with. And then something that will have already happened by the time that this episode airs, but will certainly not have reached an outcome yet. And that is the Supreme Court case Slaughter versus Trump, which is the case of the two FTC Democrat commissioners who were fired by Trump. And we will certainly not have a finality to that.
Okay.
Anytime soon. So maybe not even in the first half of 2026, but that will definitely be something that will be closely watched when that does happen, as well as cases involving tariffs. And then finally, I think, as you well know, Mike, on the M&A side, I think it'll be fascinating to see what happens with this Netflix Warner Brothers acquisition.
Yes.
Other shoes will drop potentially in that space. You and I are following how kind of the NIL markets are changing and where kind of tech figures into that whole deal and where Congress is maybe looking to step in there. And same thing on kind of the sports betting side. So these are just a whole kind of host of issues across our TMT space that all have some kind of regulatory component to them. And I think, as our listeners know, that these will continue to be closely watched by us in the months to come.
Interesting stuff. There's no shortage of things that Stefan is keeping tabs on, and we appreciate him being here today as we close this episode of Media Talk. Stefan, thanks for joining us again, and we will have you back on the program sometime probably before the first quarter ends.
Looking forward to it, Mike, and happy holidays to you and to all of our Media Talk listeners.
All right. And this is Mike Reynolds. Thanks to all of you for listening. We're going to catch up soon in the next installment of Media Talk. As Stefan said, enjoy the holidays, everybody, and have a good one.